The communication lines went dead at precisely 8:16 in the morning, and for the officers gathered in the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the silence itself became a kind of sound, a ringing absence that filled the room with dread they could not yet name. Hiroshima had simply stopped existing in the network of telephone exchanges, radio transmissions, and telegraph wires that connected the military command to its forces across the shrinking empire. Cities did not disappear. Cities burned, yes. Cities were damaged, certainly. But a city of 300,000 people did not simply cease communicating all at once, every voice going silent in the same moment, as if someone had reached down and erased it from the map like chalk from a blackboard. The expectation, built from 4 years of air raids and firebombing campaigns, was that reports would come in waves. First, the air raid sirens, then the bomber formations overhead, then the fires starting, then the casualty estimates climbing through the morning as rescue workers pulled bodies from rubble. But Hiroshima offered none of this familiar sequence. There had been sirens, yes, reporting a small formation of American aircraft. Then nothing. Not reports of fires or casualties, not pleas for reinforcements or medical supplies. Just silence, absolute and total, as if the city had been plucked from the earth and carried into some void beyond communication. The officers in Tokyo stood around maps and telephones, waiting for information that would make sense of this absence, their faces revealing confusion that would soon calcify into something far more terrible. Have you ever waited for news that you somehow already knew would change everything? Tell us in the comments about a moment when silence told you more than words ever could. And if these untold stories from history's darkest hours speak to you, hit that subscribe button now, because we're diving into the moments when the world shifted beneath people's feet and nothing would ever be the same again. The first fragmentary reports began arriving around mid-morning, carried by railway workers from stations 30 miles outside Hiroshima, by farmers who had been in their fields when the sky split open, by a military observer stationed on a hillside who had been looking toward the city when it happened. But these reports made no sense when placed beside each other, each account contradicting the others in fundamental ways that suggested either mass hallucination or wholesale breakdown in the observer's ability to process what they had witnessed. One report described a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, a light that printed shadows onto concrete and burned patterns of clothing into human skin. Another spoke of a mushroom-shaped cloud rising miles into the atmosphere, its stem a churning pillar of dust and debris, its cap spreading across the sky like some biblical plague. A third described a shockwave that had knocked people off their feet 30 miles from the city center, that had shattered windows and snapped telephone poles as if they were matchsticks. But when officers tried to reconcile these reports with conventional bombing patterns, with everything they knew about aerial warfare and explosive ordnance, the pieces refused to fit together. The largest American raids on Tokyo had involved hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of incendiary devices over several hours, creating firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. The early warning systems around Hiroshima had reported only 3 aircraft, possibly fewer. 3 bombers could not carry enough explosive material to create the effects being described. The physics simply did not work. The Americans had firebombed dozens of Japanese cities by this point in the war, and military command knew intimately the signature of such attacks: the gradual spread of fires, the hours-long duration, the specific patterns of destruction. What had happened to Hiroshima sounded like nothing in their experience. Colonel Arakawa no Toki, a staff officer who specialized in analyzing enemy capabilities, stood before a map of Hiroshima marked with red pins indicating military installations and civilian districts. He held a piece of paper containing one of the railway observer's reports, reading and rereading the description of the mushroom cloud, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had heard rumors, whispers really, about research into new types of weapons, super bombs that could destroy entire cities. These rumors had always seemed like propaganda or wishful thinking, the kind of miracle weapon stories that circulated when conventional warfare was going badly. But the specificity of these reports, their consistency on certain details even as they differed on others, suggested something unprecedented had occurred. He did not want to be the officer who spoke this possibility aloud, who suggested to his superiors that the Americans had developed a weapon beyond anything in Japan's arsenal. Such an admission felt like defeatism, like spiritual weakness in the face of adversity. The room where senior officers gathered had windows facing east, and morning light slanted through them, catching the smoke from their cigarettes and turning it blue-gray. The air was thick with tobacco and tension, with the particular quality of silence that comes when men accustomed to giving orders find themselves confronting a situation for which they have no orders to give. Field Marshal Sugiyama Gen, Chief of the Army General Staff, sat at the head of the conference table, his face composed but his hands restless, rearranging papers that did not need rearranging. He had fought in the Russo-Japanese War 4 decades earlier, had risen through ranks during Japan's expansion in China, and he understood warfare as a contest between human wills backed by industrial production. Cities could be destroyed, certainly, but destruction took time, took resources, took hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of bombs. The idea that one aircraft with one bomb could accomplish what thousands could not violated every principle of military logic he had spent a lifetime learning. Around noon, a reconnaissance aircraft was dispatched to overfly Hiroshima and report directly on the situation. The pilot chosen for this mission was a veteran with 2 years of combat experience, a man known for clear-headed observation under pressure. His aircraft lifted off from a base 200 miles from Hiroshima, climbing into clear August skies, and for 90 minutes the officers in Tokyo waited with a patience that felt like physical weight. The telephone on Sugiyama's desk sat silent, its black surface reflecting light from the windows, and men found themselves staring at it as if they could will it to ring, to deliver information that would resolve the contradictions and restore their sense of control. When the reconnaissance pilot's voice finally crackled through the radio, what he described drained the color from faces around the room. The city was gone. Not damaged, not burning, but gone. He circled at 3,000 feet, low enough to see details, and there were almost no details to see. The river delta that cradled Hiroshima remained visible, the geometric pattern of bridges and waterways intact, but the dense urban fabric that had covered it had been scraped away. Here and there, a concrete building frame stood like a skeleton, stripped of walls and roof, but the wooden structures that had comprised 90% of the city had simply vanished. Fire still burned in scattered locations, small orange spots in an ocean of gray-brown devastation. But these fires seemed almost incidental, cleanup work rather than the main event. The pilot's voice carried a quality the listening officers had never heard from him before, a kind of detachment that comes when emotional response shuts down in the face of incomprehensible input. He circled the city 3 times, describing what he saw in flat, precise terms, and then turned back toward base. The silence in the conference room after the radio went dead was different from the earlier silence. This was not the silence of waiting, but of recognition, of understanding arriving in pieces, like a puzzle assembling itself without anyone touching the pieces. Something unprecedented had happened to Hiroshima, something that exceeded the destructive capacity of conventional weapons by an order of magnitude that made previous calculations meaningless. Field Marshal Sugiyama looked around the table, meeting the eyes of his fellow officers, and saw in their faces the reflection of his own reluctant comprehension. They needed an explanation, and there was only one explanation that fit the evidence, only one that could account for a city vanishing in an instant. The nuclear physicist arrived in late afternoon, summoned from a research laboratory where Japan's own atomic weapons program had stalled and failed for lack of resources and time. His name was Yoshio Nishina, and he carried a briefcase containing papers on nuclear fission, on the theoretical possibility of weapons that derived their explosive force from splitting atoms rather than burning chemical compounds. He had studied in Germany, had published papers on quantum mechanics, and now he sat in a room full of military officers explaining physics in language they could barely grasp. The reports from Hiroshima, he told them, were consistent with atomic detonation. The flash of light, the mushroom cloud, the circular pattern of destruction radiating from a central point The burns on survivors that seemed to come from heat and light, rather than flame, all of these matched theoretical predictions for how an atomic bomb would behave. The officers listened with expressions that moved from skepticism to horror as Nishina worked through the evidence. A single bomb, he explained, containing perhaps a few kilograms of fissile material, could release energy equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives. The detonation would occur hundreds of meters above the ground, maximizing the blast effect, and the heat pulse would be intense enough to ignite anything flammable within a radius of several kilometers. Humans near the epicenter would be vaporized instantly, their bodies turned to ash before their nerves could register pain. Those farther out would suffer burns from thermal radiation, their skin scorched by light itself. And then there was the radiation, the invisible poison that would continue killing for days and weeks after the blast, that would make even survivors into casualties, their cells damaged in ways that medicine could not repair. It was not the scale of destruction that broke something in the room, but the efficiency. One aircraft with one bomb. This was industrial warfare reduced to its mathematical essence. Stripped of everything romantic or heroic, warfare as pure calculation of explosive yield divided by delivery cost. Japan had based its defense strategy on the assumption that American forces would have to fight for every inch of territory, that invasion would be so costly in American lives that terms could be negotiated. But if the Americans could destroy cities from the air, one after another, without risking bombers or crews, without giving defenders any chance to resist, then the entire strategic calculation collapsed. Tokyo could be next. Osaka, Kyoto, Nagasaki. Every urban center in Japan could be erased in sequence. The entire nation reduced to radioactive ash without a single American soldier landing on Japanese soil. Field Marshal Sugiyama's hands had stopped moving. They lay flat on the table before him, palms down, fingers splayed, as if he were trying to anchor himself to something solid while the ground shifted beneath him. He had prepared for many contingencies during his military career, had planned for different types of defeat, different ways the war might end. But he had not prepared for this, for a mode of warfare that rendered military virtue irrelevant, that made courage and discipline and fighting spirit meaningless in the face of atomic fire. How does an army defend against a weapon that gives no warning, permits no response, offers no chance for honorable combat? The question hung in the air like smoke, and no one attempted to answer it. The debate that followed was agonized and circular, the same arguments returning again and again in slightly different forms as men struggled to accept what the evidence was telling them. One faction, led by younger officers who had grown up in the age of mechanized warfare, saw the atomic bomb as simply the latest evolution in military technology. Terrible, but not fundamentally different from other weapons except in degree. They argued for immediate surrender, for accepting whatever terms the Americans offered, because continued resistance would only result in more cities vanishing, more hundreds of thousands dying in atomic fire. Japan had lost, they said, and acknowledging that loss was not cowardice but realism, not spiritual weakness but practical wisdom in the face of irresistible force. The other faction, older officers steeped in samurai tradition and the code of Bushido, found surrender incomprehensible even now, even with Hiroshima erased and the atomic threat clear. War Minister Anami Korechika spoke for this group, his voice steady and his eyes hard, arguing that Japan still possessed millions of troops, that the homeland could be defended in mountains and cities, that every invader could be made to pay in blood. The atomic bomb was terrible, yes, but it was only one weapon, and the Americans might have only a few such weapons. Japan could endure several more atomic strikes if it meant preserving the national spirit, the imperial system, the honor that came from fighting to the last, rather than surrendering while still capable of resistance. Death was preferable to the shame of capitulation, he argued, and his words carried weight with men whose entire identity was bound up in military honor and the warrior's code. Between these positions stood a third group of officers who were neither young nor old, neither advocates for immediate surrender nor believers in fighting to extinction. These men felt torn, pulled between practical recognition of military impossibility and cultural conditioning that made surrender feel like spiritual death. They sat silent through much of the debate, their faces grave, smoking cigarette after cigarette, and when they spoke it was in hypotheticals and conditional statements, testing ideas without committing to them. What if the Americans had only one atomic bomb? What if they could not produce more? What if conventional defenses could protect against atomic attack? These questions were not serious strategic analysis, but rather psychological defense mechanisms, ways of avoiding the central terrible fact that Hiroshima had revealed. Reports continued arriving from the destroyed city through the afternoon and evening, carried by survivors who had staggered out of the devastation and found telephones that still worked in outlying areas. These reports added details that made the horror more personal, more visceral. A woman described watching her children's skin slide off their bodies like wax from a candle, the flesh beneath red, and weeping. A soldier told of comrades whose eyes had melted in their sockets from the heat flash. A doctor reported that wounded people were dying not from their burns or trauma but from something else. Some invisible poison that made their hair fall out, their gums bleed, their intestines liquefy. These were symptoms the military physicians had never seen. Symptoms that Nishina, the physicist, recognized immediately as radiation sickness, the slow death that came from cellular damage at the molecular level. It was these reports of lingering death, perhaps more than the immediate destruction, that finally penetrated the psychological defenses of the officers who had argued for continued resistance. Fire kills, but it kills cleanly, and soldiers understood dying from bullets or bombs or even flame. But this weapon killed in ways that seemed almost supernatural, almost demonic, poisoning the very air and ground, making survivors wish they had died instantly with the others. One could die fighting bullets and bombs. One could not fight radiation. It was an enemy that gave no quarter, showed no mercy, could not be faced with courage because it could not be faced at all. It simply killed, invisibly and inevitably. And the realization that this was now the nature of warfare broke something in men who had believed that martial spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The meeting stretched into night, the conference room lit by electric lamps that cast yellow light on exhausted faces. Orderlies brought tea that grew cold in cups, brought rice balls that went uneaten on plates. Outside the windows, Tokyo lay dark under blackout regulations, the vast city holding its breath, waiting for news that had not yet been made public. The civilians sleeping in their homes did not yet know that Hiroshima had disappeared, did not yet understand that any of them could be next, that they were all living on borrowed time, measured not in months or weeks but in however long it took the Americans to build another atomic bomb and choose another target. The officers in the conference room carried this knowledge like a physical weight, and it showed in their slumped shoulders, in the way their hands trembled when they lifted their teacups. Around midnight, when the debate had circled back on itself for the dozenth time with no resolution in sight, someone suggested what had been unthinkable just hours earlier. They should bring the matter before the emperor. In normal circumstances, the emperor did not make policy decisions. He ratified the consensus of his advisors, provided imperial sanction to decisions already made through proper channels. But these were not normal circumstances, and there was no consensus, only deadlock between those who saw atomic weapons as the end of all things and those who saw surrender as worse than annihilation. If the emperor spoke, his word would break the deadlock, would provide the authority necessary to override the hardliners who believed death preferable to capitulation. The imperial conference was convened in the early morning hours of August 6th, though by then it was technically already August 7th, the clocks having passed midnight. While men argued about the meaning of extinction, the emperor entered the room in silence, and the assembled officers bowed so deeply their foreheads nearly touched the floor. He was a small man, slightly built, with thick glasses that magnified his eyes and gave him a scholarly appearance inappropriate to his role as divine sovereign and supreme commander. He had been largely silent throughout the war, allowing his military advisors to make strategy, providing his name and authority but not his voice. Now, with Hiroshima gone and the question of national survival on the table, his silence was no longer tenable. The officers presented the situation in terms carefully chosen to avoid blame or defeatism. They described the atomic bomb's unprecedented destructive power, the impossibility of defending against such weapons, the likelihood that more cities would be destroyed in coming days. They laid out the military situation. The Soviet Union had just entered the war against Japan, opening a new front in Manchuria that could not be defended, and the Americans controlled the sea and air so completely that reinforcement or resupply was impossible. The question, stated as neutrally as possible, was whether Japan should continue fighting in hopes of achieving better surrender terms, or accept the Potsdam Declaration immediately and end the war before more atomic bombs fell. The emperor listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When the last speaker finished, silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of men breathing and the distant hum of electric lights. Then the emperor spoke, and his voice was soft but carried to every corner of the chamber. Continuing the war, he said, would lead to the obliteration of the Japanese people and the destruction of human civilization. The atomic bomb had changed the nature of warfare fundamentally, had made previous calculations meaningless. To continue fighting when continuation meant only more atomic fire falling on defenseless cities was not courage but madness, not honor but the betrayal of his responsibility to preserve the people and the nation. He spoke of the unbearable, of having to endure the unendurable, and his words acknowledged what his military advisors could not. That surrender was the only rational choice, that pride must yield to survival, that Japan must lay down its arms and accept whatever came next. The officers in the room bowed their heads, and several wept openly, their tears falling onto the polished floor. War Minister Anami, who had argued most passionately for continued resistance, felt something crack inside his chest, a physical sensation like breaking ice. He had believed, truly and completely believed, that Japanese spirit could overcome American material advantage, that determination and sacrifice could achieve victory even against impossible odds. Hiroshima had proven him wrong, had demonstrated that spirit without adequate material means was just another form of suicide. He would commit ritual suicide within days, unable to live with the shame of surrender. But in that moment, he simply bowed and accepted the emperor's words as final. The decision to surrender did not erase Hiroshima. The city remained gone, its 300,000 people still dead or dying, their bodies ash or walking wounded, their home reduced to a circular scar of fused earth and broken concrete. In the days that followed, as Japan moved toward official capitulation, more reports arrived from the destroyed city, each one adding details that made the horror more comprehensive, more total. Doctors described patients whose white blood cell counts dropped to zero, whose bone marrow simply stopped producing the cells necessary for life. Engineers reported that the heat pulse had fused sand into glass, had turned metal into flowing liquid, had generated temperatures approaching the surface of the Sunday. Survivors spoke of shadows printed onto walls, the permanent silhouettes of people who had been vaporized instantly, their bodies turned to energy, leaving only these ghost images to mark their existence. The Japanese High Command's response to Hiroshima, that mixture of disbelief and horror and reluctant acceptance, revealed something profound about the nature of military culture and the limits of martial virtue. These were men who had built their entire identities around concepts of honor, duty, and fighting spirit, who had been trained to see death in battle as the highest form of service. But the atomic bomb existed outside the framework that gave meaning to military service. There was no honor in dying from radiation sickness. There was no virtue in being vaporized by heat flash. There was no opportunity for courage when the weapon gave no warning and permitted no response. The bomb reduced warfare to pure mathematics, to calculations of explosive yield and casualty projections, and in that reduction, it revealed the bankruptcy of the entire ideological system that had justified Japan's wars of expansion. 75 years later, the words spoken in that Tokyo conference room exist only in fragments and recollections, in official minutes that sanitized the emotion and private diaries that captured the anguish. But the essential truth remains clear in every account. The men who decided Japan's fate in August 1945 were not simply responding to military defeat, but to a weapon that had changed the nature of reality itself, that had demonstrated humanity's newfound ability to destroy not just armies or cities, but potentially all of human civilization. Their confusion, their denial, their eventual acceptance traced a psychological journey from the world of conventional warfare into the atomic age, from a universe where honor and courage mattered to one where only survival mattered, where the question was no longer how to win, but how to avoid extinction. The silence from Hiroshima that morning in August spoke louder than any words the Japanese high command could find to describe it, and in that silence the old world ended and something new and terrible was born, something we still live with today, the knowledge that we possess the means to erase not just cities but ourselves, that the flash of light and the mushroom cloud wait forever at the edge of human consciousness, reminding us that there are some weapons so powerful that their only victory is the one where they are never used. Subscribe to hear more of history's moments when words failed and silence revealed truths too large for language, when the world changed in an instant and nothing would ever be the same again.